Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. So 50 million people in Pakistan are estimated to be suffering from mental disorders, and 24 million people are estimated to be in need of psychiatric care. What socio-cultural factors in communities, households, schools, and workplaces are contributing to the mental health crisis in Pakistan? This is the topic for our discussion today. I am Alina Khan. I work as a program analyst with the United States Institute of Peace, which is a Washington based think tank striving to address the key drivers of conflict in Pakistan. I'm also part of the Global Shapers community in Islamabad, which is a volunteer community of young activists working on various causes, including mental health. I'm joined today I'm very humbled and privileged to be joined today by thought leaders in the field of mental health, including Dr. Anjhula Singh Bais. Dr. Anjhula is an international psychologist and trauma specialist with expertise in social and personality psychology, psychoanalysis, relationships, and spirituality. Currently, Dr. Anjhula is based in Malaysia as the director at Amnesty International Malaysia. Dr. Anjhula has worked with patients in diverse cultural settings, including India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Africa, and the States, and brings unique cross-cultural insights to the table. We also have today with us Dr. Ayesha Mian. Dr. Ayesha Mian is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who is currently teaching as an associate professor of psychiatry at Agha University, Karachi, and is also leading the gender equality program for Agha University Global. Dr. Ayesha has also been the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Agha University, Karachi for 7 years. Last but not the least, Dr. Bushra Malik is a social psychologist with a PhD in social and applied psychology from University of Sussex, UK. Dr. Bushra is currently teaching as an assistant professor at International Islamic University, Islamabad. And some key research areas that interest Dr. Bushra include social and individual identity formation in a cultural context. Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. Without further ado, let's just get the conversation started because we have some very intricate topics that we want to deconstruct today. So starting off with you, Dr. Ayesha. Mental health has and continues to be a stigma, especially in developing countries like Pakistan. And most efforts in destigmatizing mental health have focused on highlighting the biological aspect of mental illnesses and how these biological aspects are similar to other physical illnesses. But how important are biological factors like genetic vulnerability and biochemical imbalance as causes of mental illness? And what part do psychological and social factors play in compromising the mental well-being of an individual? These are some of the questions that I would really appreciate if you could start the conversation with. Over to you, Dr. Ayesha.
Thank you so much, Alina. First of all, I just want to say kudos to you because anybody who starts this conversation around mental health, I feel that this is such a needed topic, especially in, well, now all over the world. I think with the pandemic, it was already sort of the burden of mental health was so huge, and now with the pandemic, we're looking at a parallel pandemic in the area of mental health. So thank you for taking up this cause. You've been very active on Twitter, social media, even with your first panel that you did. So I really appreciate that. So your question is, how important are psychosocial factors? They are. I think that especially if you look at sort of developing countries like we are in Pakistan, some of the psychosocial aspects like poverty, unemployment, and with gender-based violence and child abuse, some of those reasons become very important as we look at the burden of mental health in Pakistan. I subspecialize, I'm an adult psychiatrist, but also subspecialize in child adolescent psychiatry. And Pakistan, half of Pakistan's population is people under the age of 24, right? So we're looking at about 100 plus million people that are young. And especially when we look at youth mental health, I think first of all, education I really feel that that is a big concern and big cause of mental burden in our children and adolescents is our education system. It's a very archaic system, and we are very plugged into sort of just looking at academia from a very myopic focus. We don't look at the sort of comprehensive education of our children, and that causes significant amount of stress amongst our children. And then these kids, because we don't train them in terms of vocational training programs, in terms of how is it that they can go on and get good jobs, and we don't focus on career developments and stuff, there's significant amount of unemployment. So all of these actually plug into the burden of mental health disorders. So yes, we have the biological factors, and that is one of the easier ways of plugging into anti-stigma programs. And I use that all the time. I say this all the time that, if your kidneys are not working, you'll get kidney stones. If your pancreas are not working, you'll get diabetes. If your brain has, issues up and down, so of course you'll get anxiety, depression. Please treat it like a medical disorder. So yes, that is important for us to talk about. But for countries like ours, I think it would be very myopic of us and very narrow-minded and narrow-focused of us if we don't look at the other psychosocial and the socioeconomic factors.
Thank you, Dr. Ayesha. You've raised some really important points about the mental health burden, particularly on youth, given that they form more than 60% of the population. Dr. Bushra, you've done some really interesting research work on the formation of identity in the social context of Pakistan. What is the relationship between identity and mental well-being, and how does this relationship manifest itself in Pakistan's social context?
Thank you, Alina. Thank you very much for the kind introductions at the start of the conversation and keeping me on board. As you have rightly said that most of my research and primarily my PhD research is all about finding identity formation among adolescents and young adults and its implication for their psychological and their social well-being. So prior to that, because there is an age bracket, identity is a very fundamental issue that is actually associated with an individual by the very birth of an individual. But the most salient and most critical time to actually develop that coherent and a firm sense of identity is adolescent age and the age of adulthood. And that was the age bracket that I have worked on. So when I started working upon that, and as the very topic of your conversation and today's moderated session is all about, say, South Asian, and then there is a clear divide between the Western discourse about identity formation and Eastern and more specifically South Asian and particularly Pakistani context about identity formation. And the fundamental thing that people fail to negotiate with when they have come up with the question, who we are, what is the main purpose of life, this is what identity is actually from an individual perspective. And there then the normative pressure that you have talked about, Dr. Ayesha has rightly talked about some of the parenting styles, some of the institutional hindrances, and when you are failed to conform to the societal standards, and there then the problem between what you believe in, how you define yourself, and how the other person or the institution or any referent point in the society actually expects you to perform and behave. And there then that divide actually creates psychological troubles and mental illnesses, especially upon the young people who are at the age of adolescent and who are actually at the age of emerging adulthood. And if they fail to develop that kind of a self-awareness about their own potentials, about their own capabilities, about their own abilities, and then they take a huge pressure and a burden what society expects from them, and they lost their sense of their own purpose and agency within themselves, and that is the primary root cause of mean of the psychological problem that arises particularly at that age. And if it is not being resolved with the help of a psychological aid, then it manifests itself in a very adverse consequences later in life. So, and all those things that I'm talking about are the things that I have actually demonstrated and established from some of the empirical work that I have done in Pakistan, and I have some cross-cultural comparisons of the work I've done in Pakistan with the youth living in UK, and there then I could see the contextual and the cultural differences. So what I would like to emphasize over here is whenever you talk about mental illnesses and certain psychological concepts like we are talking about identity, it is very important, it is very primitive to actually take into account the context where these things take place. And then mental illnesses can have a similar manifestation, for example, in West and in Pakistan, but the very cause is different. When we identify the cause, then we can need to deal with that differently, and it's a unique spectrum in which that mental illness actually exists.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. So you've raised some really critical points about the role of identity in, in its relationship with both mental well-being and mental illness. Dr. Anjhula, women have been observed to have significantly higher risk of anxiety and mood disorders than men, while men pose significantly higher risk of disruptive behavior and substance abuse disorders than women. In Pakistan, particularly, one trend we see common in multiple studies is the higher prevalence rates of depression and anxiety in women as opposed to men. What do you think are the reasons for these gender disparities in prevalence rates of different mental illnesses? And do you think that the established gender identities and roles in Pakistan's social context have something to do with this phenomena?
Firstly, Alina, thank you so much. Kudos to you for having such a multidisciplinary panel. And I think that is actually key to increasing mental health. So we don't have an echo chamber. So I'm so pleased that my fellow panelists, we have social psychology, trauma psychology, psychiatry, and then obviously an adolescence focus, which means Dr. Ayesha must be in demand every single day. But I mean, the short answer to your question is, yeah, absolutely. Gender roles are a problem everywhere in the world, but like Dr. Bushra was saying, like how it will manifest is, specific to a culture. And she was also talking about almost like a funneling, there's loosely speaking with generalizations, there's a sort of Western construct, there's Eastern, then there's South Asian, and then, the Indian, let's say, subcontinent, and then Pakistan. But it's not, it doesn't even stop there, right? There's ethno-lingual, ethno-religious, ethno-racial. There's so much diversity in Pakistan, and that's actually what makes South Asia particularly unique in the world, right? So having said that, but I do think if you're gonna sort of look at it from a psychoanalytic Jungian point of view, there is a collective uprising of women. I mean, it's just the suppression, it's too much in Pakistan, in India, in Sri Lanka. It took forever for America to catch up. And right now, they broke history with first female, first Black, first Asian vice president. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Bushra. There's very myopic, the sort of DSM and international classifications of diseases. It depends on which time in history you're living in. And right now it's still very individual, Western based. But I can tell you, like, the lens in which I approach psychology, besides spirituality, is also from a feminist point of view. And I know that can raise shackles. When I was doing research in Sri Lanka, I would have a lot of people say that, human rights, feminism is such a Western import. And then I'd have to remind them, let's not get caught up on tomato. There are plenty of examples in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in India, in the subcontinent, of women that absolutely meet the definition of, sort of empowered and not in that patriarchal snare, trying to break out of it. And I guess what I'm trying to say, when we look at it holistically and collectively, which is this part of the world's forte, we don't exist in a vacuum, right? So what religion, what institution, what public and private schooling. How was your family, how did your family raise you? I say, you know, if you're getting married and you decide to get married, it's like marrying a different or a difficult ideology. Some people are democratic republics. Some, you know, your in-laws might feel like communist, and it's very different. In terms of answering your question of why there's, you know, depression's more prevalent, besides the obvious oppression, there is a cultural conditioning of what femininity means. So there's fascinating research, right? So if my male colleague gets a raise, his locus of control internally is because I'm awesome. And if a woman gets a raise, she's like, I got lucky. My colleagues helped me. When women have to take math tests, if they don't have to write their name, they score just as well as men. But when they have to write their name, they are subconsciously crying for their gender. And then it goes down, the scores, because the common narrative worldwide, but especially in the South Asian cultures, that's, you know, STEM topics, or it's a male dominated thing. And I always tell my female clients in therapy that anger that you have, and it's very legitimate, anger turned inwards is depression. And we are not given the social societal approval of sanction as women to express anger. Men will be men. You know, even the way newborn infant boys are held, it's much more relaxed. It's, you know, men are tougher, males are tougher, it's rough and tumble. Newborn baby girls are held like a fragile teacup. So that conditioning, society, everything starts from a very, very early age, and then we can't find our voice. But the good news is that's changing. And it starts with actually having all women panels like this.
Thank you, Dr. Anjhula. That was a very good depiction of the social context which is relevant when it comes to gender identities in Pakistan, maybe to quite an extent in India as well, and in South Asia. These are unfortunately some commonalities and similarities that we share. So, Dr. Anjhula, you raised a very important point about how this this social conditioning, in terms of gender identities and roles, starts from a very early age in how we're raised. Which brings me to the next question about, what parenting styles are most common in Pakistan, in South Asia. How do these parenting styles affect the mental and emotional development of children and adolescents, and how do gender roles dictate how we parent and raise our girls and boys?
So I'm actually looking at Dr. Ayesha, because that's totally, you know, her forte. But I will answer what I see, because just today, so sort of professionally and personally and anecdotally, just today I was in a transpersonal psychology workshop. It was across 2 days, and I was jokingly, but it's true, I was telling the participants that we reach an inflection point in therapy where, you know, parents hate me because they're expecting me to be this authoritarian like them, and they're like, what is this compassion, right? And so for a while, Dr. Anjhula is corrupting their child, is the target, because a lot of times parents will enter therapy and they will literally say, fix my child. And respectfully, I will say that after one session with a child, I'm like, the parents need to come in. You know, and as a trauma specialist, it's intergenerational trauma that's passed. And again, I'm not, there's obviously outliers, but just generally speaking, without trying to make a blanket statement, the South Asian paradigm is authoritarian parenting, right? And I can't tell you how many times in therapy I hear, well, I mean, and this is a red flag for me. I was raised like that and I turned out fine. I'm like, if you really did, you wouldn't have to state that. You know, and it's that whole, I walked from my village for 5 miles with bata chappals or slippers and all of that, not recognizing that it's a new generation and we want to build on that, right? And it's stuck in the past. And I'm all for respect for human beings, fundamentally from a human rights perspective. And this is what I try to I try to put across with my therapy clients. From a human rights perspective, everyone has a fundamental right to be alive, okay? But that is different from having to like that person. And our disproportionate emphasis on respect your elders, no matter what, gives way to so much sexual abuse and, you know, pink elephant in the room and hiding things under the carpet. Is my grandfather, it's my, you know, and they prey on that. So, I mean, probably the most rewarding thing as a professional is, and it, again, we can see this across gender lines, because mothers are expected to take care of the kids. That's their domain. I don't agree with that. But generally what happens is a mother will be like, you empowered my daughter to speak up, and, you know, by a sliver, she missed being sexually abused. And it's so interesting in 2020 how brothers and sisters, you know, are differentially treated. And then, you know, a lot of times, like, for example, in India, the Nirbhaya gang rape was really, you know, that was almost a worldwide topic, but definitely in India. And to see I always say you know, therapy is not about blaming parents, but it's about assigning responsibility. And the kind of comments, you know, boys will be boys. Fathers are out making a living. The mothers are great enablers. You know, they will have their daughters, make the chai, you know, wash the dishes, do the laundry. And then is it illogical that your son will grow up, probably become a husband, and can't understand his wife because she's a glorified domestic help? So even from a personal point of view, if I attend a coffee, a lunch, a dinner in Malaysia, I mean, even very well-educated, quote unquote, what should be maybe open-minded, they will tell their daughters, like, serve the guests, you know, bring them whatever, snacks, hors d'oeuvres, samosas. And they're like, Anjhula, you're not eating. And I'm like, I won't until your son gets up and serves it. And then it's just like paradigm shift.
Thank you, Dr. Anjhula, for very candid and very, very much needed candid views on this dilemma. Moving to you, Dr. Ayesha. Um, so authoritarian parenting and the sort of differential treatment based on the gender identity of children. How does this impact children in Pakistan?
Okay, so yeah, you're getting me started on something that I feel so passionately about, right? So, you know, one of the things that I joke about all the time is that I wish I had one treatment option, which I call parentectomy, where I can take those kids away from the parents, because I'm like, you can't go back to this house because, you know, how will you ever get better? And also I feel like for everything we need a test, right? For driving you need a test, for everything, but there is no test for parenting, right? Like anybody is allowed to become a parent. And in Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, you know, it's like that's the best thing we do is just breed kids, even when we just don't know what to do with them. And this whole idea that, you know, bache hai pal jayenge, like they will sort of, you know, nurture themselves, that doesn't happen. There's a science to parenting, there's a art to parenting, there's a responsibility to parenting, and you know, you've taken that responsibility of bringing a human being into this world, so you'd better know what you're doing. And if you don't know that, you'd better know that I don't know, and go ask someone who can help you know what you're doing. So that we don't treat kids like, you know, that these are human beings that we are raising and this is our future, and you know, we have a solid sort of responsibility and part to play in what they're going to be doing after 10 years or 20 years of, you know, when they become adults. So yes, there's the whole authoritarian, but you know, one thing that we're all very good at in our South Asian culture is raising kids with guilt. So it's not just the Catholic guilt, but like everything is, you know, it's like you're emotionally blackmailing them, you're guilt, you know, it's like it's all guilt ridden, that if you do this, wo naraz ho jayenge, wo gussa ho jayenge, you know, Allah is going to be naraz, or, you know, it's like whatever it might be, there's always somebody who's going to get upset with you, who's going to not like what you're doing, or there'll be fear of consequence. And that really, I think, throttles people, kids. There's no creativity, there's no independence, there's no empowerment, there's no sense of self that they can really explore and develop into, which is very, very concerning to me. So I think that that is the first thing which I tell parents: stop doing that. Don't raise your kids by guilting them into, marks achhe aane chahiye, ya, you have to respect your elders like this, or because that they just can't develop, as Dr. Bushra was also saying, that that's identity development, and you're actually thwarting that. The gender piece, again, I lead AKU's global effort on gender equity, again, something so close to my heart. And as Dr. Anjhula was also saying, it starts so early. It starts from the place where, again, when you're holding the infant, oh, my little princess, oh, I have to protect you from everything. Hey, my boy, look, I have a boy, completely. That just kind of sets the tone right there. And then you're talking louder, you're letting the world know that you have a boy, and you're like hiding your daughter. And then and when I am in panels like this, I always bring up my example as well. Like I was the eldest. My dad said go study, and everything. So yes, and there's always that you have to have a dad or a husband who's allowed you to kind of so it's also by stroke of luck that my father was one of those that said go study and do whatever you want to do, and then my husband was like, why are you asking me the answer, better, kind of thing. But that just happened, right? It may not have happened, and then I might have been on a completely different trajectory. So we are still at a place where our males are deciding in some ways for us what is going to be okay and what's not going to be okay. And then little things that happen. So I have a son and a daughter, and my brother has 3 daughters, and every time these kids are together, my mom will always ask the girls to do the housework, right? Because she's like, and I'm like, why aren't you telling my son? Ryan is also there. Please tell him to do something as well. And she's like, yeah, but teen aur ladkiyan hai na. If they weren't there, then yes, I would ask him. And it's I have to make it a point where, and I'm like, and I've trained all the other girls to also sort of tell my son that, hey, no, you also need to get up and do your bit. But it's those unsaid things, it's those covert messages that happen in each and every household. The girls are told to sit like this, my son can wear his shorts, sit whatever way he wants to, the girls seedha baitho, pav niche rakho, ye karo. So you kind of are raised to feel that we need to take responsibility of keeping ourselves safe, we need to take responsibility of making sure that everybody in the house is taken care of. Also, girls are, in some ways, if boys are asked to do something as they're growing up, okay, why don't you go wash the car and we'll pay you this much, you go mow the lawn and we'll pay you this much. Girls are going to wash and clean and stuff, nobody pays them for doing that, because you're somehow expected to do unpaid work. And that's what we grew up to be like. It's so hard for me to ask for a raise, it's so hard for me, and if somebody gives me like this thing to do, that okay, Dr. Ayesha, we want you to lead the gender equity, I'm so happy that they're asking me to do the work that I'm not even going to say, hey, pay me for this, right? Just the fact that, oh, I'm being allowed, they actually think I'm good enough to lead this thing is good enough for me, which is not okay. Men would never do anything if they're not going to get paid. So lots of different covert messages that happen, which again, I think, lead to us becoming the way women, becoming the way that they are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayesha. Dr. Bushra, do you have anything to add on parenting, how it interacts with gender in Pakistan and in South Asia's social context?
Thank you very much, Adina. As Dr. Ayesha has rightly mentioned, that there are, and Dr. Anjhula as well, that there are fundamental differences in the way men and women and maybe girls and boys are being raised in Pakistan. So again, referring to my own research interests, the fundamental question is about norms, which are not necessarily productive and not necessarily right norms. There can be something wrong with the norms, because it's a societal norm that girl need to do so and so rules in the society, and the boys are actually raised to follow certain rules in the society. But the fundamental thing that I'm always inquisitive about is, and I try to answer to that, is the root cause of divide, and that is a global debate all over the world, that there is a crude power imbalance between men representative and a woman representation in science and technology. And when I went into the field and I tried to answer that question, that what is the major reason of the digital gender divide? And the interesting thing and very fascinating thing that I came across is when it comes to boys' education, then parents invest more. And because science and technology and those education and those fields are relatively more demanding in terms of finances and economic, and take a large economic share. So when it comes to actually paying for a boy and raising him, so they prefer him to be into a profession which can actually make them successful in their career, so that they earn more money and they can be very progressive into their careers. However, when it comes to the career choice about the girls, they are being actually sent for the social sciences, which are relatively cheaper fields to actually upon the pocket of the parents to actually pay for their fee. So again, the thing is, if the patriarchy is of course a fundamental question, but why the root cause of the patriarchy sometimes end up being the women than the fathers. And the reason is, again, the psychological norm of having a control. So if you are being raised into a controlled environment, there are two possible ways you will negotiate with that. One way will be, you will be far more controlling to the offsprings afterwards, to the people, juniors, subordinates, and your children afterwards. And the other expression is you're going to challenge that, you're going to discuss that, and you are taking the charge to change that. And there then we leak the advice and proper assistance to women, as well as when parents that this is the time, if you are being raised into a norms which are meant to be wrong, and they have created a divide in the society, so much so that there is a great gender digital divide. And for a larger part, we have acknowledged in Pakistan, in traditional society like Pakistan, we have acknowledged women's role as an economic counterpart, but we have not yet acknowledged men's role as a domestic counterpart. And that is the thing that we need to discuss and debate, and then so that each among us, being a professional, being a parent, being just an advisor, being a teacher, we should, there's a high time to actually debate about, discuss about, write down those wrong norms that we are up till now adhering to. And there then, once we actually take the charge of, okay, what went wrong in the society and how we can fix that, and only afterwards we will be able to actually generate further new norms of enlightenment, of equality, whether it's gender equality or gender equity. And then there will be far more freedom of expression and the personal agency that people will be able to exert upon. So in international societies like ours, the fundamental problem is with the so-called norms, which are primarily not adaptive in nature, and we need to challenge them and discuss them and debate them.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. So the prevalent social norms dictate not only the social institution of family and household, but also dictate other social institutions which play a critical part in how we, formulate our identity, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with others, essentially our mental and emotional well-being. So, what practices in schools, particularly in Pakistan and the South Asia's social context, lead to long-lasting adverse effects on the mental and emotional development of children? Dr. Anjhula, if you could comment on that.
Yep. Just really quickly, I love what the panelists were saying. I'm so glad to know that I am not the only one who thinks parents should take a licensing exam. Just because you have the reproductive facilities doesn't mean you need to use it. And to what I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Bushra was saying about let's not normalize dysfunction, right? But it's very interesting. Like, I mean, if you look at the sort of research, and I acknowledge that it's global north white undergraduate students and younger ages, I get it, but I do think it points to a trend that's sort of worldwide. If you ask a female, around the age of 6 or 7, what do you want to be when you grow up? They very likely can say prime minister, president. And then in school, I mean, barring a male classmate who's like, what, you can't be president if your country doesn't have that representation, right? It's very interesting. You won't see necessarily Sri Lankan students say that because first female prime minister, right, in modern history. So it's very interesting how females, their space temporally and otherwise starts shrinking as they get older. I mean, from the playground, how they cover up, how they play, they literally mentally and physically take up less space. And, you know, I can chart an uptick in my private practice exactly by when it's exam time. And parents walk in with enough anxiety for themselves and their children. And it's such a catastrophizing line of thought. You know, you need to score this for your exams because that leads to, you know, a university admission, which then leads to a good job, which leads to, you know, security, and maybe whatever, depending on your gender, attracting a good spouse. And that has a lot, this is why we can't look at it from a Western clinical point of view. It has a lot to do with developmental economics and so on and so forth. So it's a multi-pronged approach that's needed. And, you know, and people watching this might think it's funny, but when Kamala Harris became Vice President of the United States of America, there was a meme that was circulating on social media with an South Asian uncle going, Vice President? Why not President? You know, and people think it's funny, but I think as mental health professionals on this call, we really realize the truth to that. Because, you know, what you focus on expands, and there is this ethos of nothing's good enough, you know. And you can see, I haven't particularly studied the suicide statistics in Pakistan, but I have a feeling it would mirror India. At exam time, because of the population and the competitiveness, like clockwork, the suicide uptick is just unbelievable, and any life lost is absolutely a tragedy. And it's startling how novel it is when I say you know, your exams are something you do. It's not who you are. And it's a snapshot, by the way, of a particular point of time in school. And the last thing I'll just add is, you know, the ethos of shaming and corporal punishment, that maybe we all know that there's a difference between what is law and what is actually implemented. So we can't just sit there and flatter ourselves and go, but we have a law. We need to have that implemented. And that is extremely dysfunctional and damaging. The whole ethos of you need to break down children in order to make them succeed, otherwise they'll be soft. You know, and that look at what your cousin did, look at what your neighbor did. And I call that the compare and despair phenomenon, absolutely unnecessary and very dysfunctional.
Thank you, Dr. Anjhula. So, Dr. Ayesha, corporal punishment and this unrealistic pressure of succeeding and achieving, and this creation of a do or die scenario. Some of the things that Dr. Anjhula highlighted as you know, dysfunctional practices in schools, which, you know, have an adverse effect on the mental and emotional well-being of children. What other practices in schools do you think adversely affect children when it comes to their mental and emotional well-being?
So, Leah, I want to say right now that this is so worrisome to me, that when I hear Dr. Anjhula talking about this, I can feel honestly my anxiety building up, because I went through all of this as a child, right? And it's hard. It's not just my family. It's not just my parents. You know, I came first in my first grade, so then it was just like, okay, you've got to just keep doing this. And if I didn't, then it was just a problem. And it was a lot of pressure from school. It was a lot of pressure from the context around me, that you've just got to keep at it, otherwise you're no good, right? And then it was not just academics. Okay, so fine, you're good at academics. How about, do you make good eggs? How about, do you dress well? How about, so there's always just this intense pressure all around. And, as a 46-year-old, I still feel the anxiety when I hear that, we're still doing the same thing. I can viscerally feel it right now. I'm saying this because it's important. It takes, and I've worked on myself, and I've said, hey, get out of it. You don't need to keep proving yourself, but it's just become so integrated into you that you just kind of, you have to constantly keep having that conversation with yourself to get out of this conditioning that happens so early. So school conditioning is so important. Like, I think it becomes such a big part of you. A couple of other things that our schools do. So I agree. So O-level, A-level, that time starts, January starts, and my clinic starts filling up, okay? With O-level and A-level students. It's parents, they're crazy, they're neurotic. I'm saying it out here because I want them to know that they're neurotic and they need to stop doing this. And then, you know, when their kids are, girls and boys are coming up with suicidal ideation, with severe depression, with burnout, with they're just kind of, they just can't function anymore. Then they're like, oh, but please tell them, Dr. Ayesha, we don't want them to go to Ivy Leagues. It doesn't matter to us where they go and where do they get their admission. It doesn't matter to us how many A stars they get. But that's not what you've been telling them since kindergarten and grade 1. So, you know, now if you're saying this to them, they know that to be a lie. They know that it matters to you. If you've put them in 7 different tuitions above and beyond the school that they're going to, so they know that this matters to you. And when you're saying things like, you know, why 98, 100 CUNY, they know it matters to you. 98 is not good enough. So, you know, it's like that, it's too late. By the time it's O-levels and A-levels and your kids are really just kind of shutting down because they can't function anymore, it's too late. If, you know, I've had lots of kids who are really smart, and I work with this whole strata of Karachi society that go to all of these elite schools. And, you know, these kids will come and tell me, are you, you know, when I ask them, are you feeling any better? Yes, I've put you on medications. Are you feeling less depressed? Are you feeling less anxious? It's so sad to hear them say, well, what does that look like, Dr. Ayesha? We don't know what feeling good or feeling happy feels like. I wouldn't know. How sad is that? How sad is it when a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old says something like this? So I think that there is just a major need to kind of relook at what we're doing to our children. A couple of other things that are different from sort of this whole academic pressure. It's very colonial, by the way, that, you know, it's like when we were colonized by the British, the only way we could move forward was through education. So that's when, you know, that's when it became prevalent in our society, and that's why that's what we're still doing. I usually will get these 6-year-old, 7-year-old boys that mothers will bring, and they will say, Dr. Ayesha, please fix my boy. And here's like a really sweet, gentle, quiet boy sitting in the clinic. And I'm like, what do you mean fix my boy? He's very effeminate. He's very quiet. He's very gentle. He's very sweet. He doesn't go out and play rough like the other boys. And my husband's worried, and my mother-in-law is worried, and my family is worried that he's, and I'm sitting there thinking, hey, we need more men like that. Please let him be this way, right? We need thoughtful men. We need soft-spoken, you know, men like that. And so that pressure, we're still okay. We've become okay with girls being tomboys and dressing up in jeans and caps and stuff. But if you have a sweet, gentle, quiet, soft-spoken boy, that's somehow not okay. And so there's also all this pressure on boys as well, which is important for us to understand, that I think we miss out when we're talking about gender. We just really just talking about girls. So there's that bit. And the last bit is creativity. We don't do creative work. So one of the things that I do with when kids first come to see me is the younger ones, I have them do a house tree person drawing. They can draw a house, draw a tree, draw a person. It's very sad for me to see that, you know, I would have 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds who are unable to draw just a house, a tree, a person. They will write very nice A, B, C, D. They've got lovely handwriting. They've got all of those things. They can add up to, you know, do all sorts of multiplications in their heads and stuff, but they are not able to draw, paint, be creative. And that's very concerning to me because, again, there's no music, there's no art, there's no creative writing, there's no story reading, there's no book reading in our schools, which I think is very, very short-sighted from our end as well. So.
Thank you, Dr. Ayesha. Dr. Bushra, creativity is obviously a form of self-expression. Dr. Aisha highlighted some really important issues of how we're not empowering our children to express themselves. Do you have anything to add to these sort of dysfunctional practices that we have at schools and at households from a lens of identity formation, particularly?
Absolutely, Alina. Primarily, I think the one thing that we haven't talked about is there is another tier to parenting. Sometimes there are parents who are very thoughtful of their children and they want to actually, they observe something and they come up with the complaints, okay, something is going wrong with my child, how I can actually not fix that, how can I deal with that. But another tier that we have missed is the joint family system in Pakistan, dada, dadi, nana, nani, pupi, uncle and aunts, and their pressure and their expectations toward the child. However, being an academic, we cannot possibly go and change the family institutions. What we can do is to bring about reforms at the educational institutions. And the things that I observed are more most productive that can be introduced at the schools. And we do some of the practices at the university, that is bringing in some creative exercises that Dr. Aisha has rightly mentioned, and giving some platforms to the students to actually engage in those activities. These can include mindfulness trainings like yoga practices, giving them some gym and equipment, or having some sports into the in the schools, colleges and universities that actually give them some kind of a platform to exert and generate their energy in a more productive manner, and will be and one of the very possible and resilient ways to actually negotiate with any anxieties and maybe depression and maybe any dissatisfaction and unhappiness they are experiencing, in particular because I'm having most experience in higher education. So one of the fundamental things that is lacking and that actually does not prepare whether boys or the girls to be productive at their workplaces, the divide between industry and academia. So for the schools, Dr. Aisha is the right person to actually comment upon what are the activities which are more fruitful. However, from the higher education point of view, the thing that I have observed, and I've done some empirical work upon that, is the divide between academia and industry. So apprenticeships, internships, making students visit the workplace more often, and having a collaborative linkages between the real world and what is being taught into the theory, that can actually hamper some of the insecurities, anxieties, and that will give children a kind of a sense of a purpose, sense of a choice, and sense of autonomy to actually choose from various options. And maybe this is the thing they are lacking from their families. And sometimes we just cannot possibly change their families. What we can possibly change is the person who is going to be the agent of their choices. So if they want to be a doctor, if they want to be a social worker, if they want to be an industrialist or a banker, they should actually explore all those options by themselves and make those choices which they find they are mentally capable of doing. So for me, that's the thing that is lacking, again, because of the normative pressures. Pakistan is one of the countries who is having very tight norms. So sometimes you cannot possibly go to their homes and change their families. What you can bring about the change is change in the child that you are dealing with, you are teaching, or who are with you on board, maybe in your clinical practice or maybe as a student, and making them realize how to identify and empower themselves and realizing their own potential and be successful in life and making choices by them by their own mind, by their own explorations.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. So the only institution left now is workplaces. What are the common stresses at workplaces, and how do they affect men and women differently? Dr. Anjhula, if you could comment on that.
So just really quickly, because I think Dr. Bushra is making some great points. Just as an example from the region, Singapore has employed educational psychologists, and from, if I'm not mistaken, from first standard to fourth standard, they've done away with exam scores because the government realized that, like Steve Cook, who used to be part of Apple or maybe still is, said once famously that, India or Singapore is never going to come up with an iPhone. They might come up with how to replicate one or copy, but where is the originality and creativity? And we always see that scandal in Bollywood. There's some lawsuit of you copied Hollywood and so on and so forth, right? And it actually stems from what my fellow panelists are saying. And so the Singapore government has done that because there's so much anxiety in society that the fertility rate actually dropped. And they needed to pay people, incentives to have children. And they realized that, soft skills like dialogue and debate are equally important than just hardcore achievement. So I just wanted to say that because that's actually an example from the region. Oh, so where do I start with work? That's interesting. Fun times. Dr. Ayesha already, and I applaud that sort of openness about what it means to be, it's just a paradigm difference between how work is construed, across gender lines. Whereas she's thinking, wow, I'm lucky to be on this panel. And the guy's like, yeah, how much is it going to cost? And how much am I going to charge rather? And it's interesting, again, empirically, if a male is hitting 20 or 30% of a job description, he's like, why not? I'll apply. And women will hit 98% of the job description and they'll still think about it. Imposter syndrome runs rampant, no matter what. There's an amazing book that maybe, on Facebook, or you can share on, with the Global Shapers Islamabad. I consider it mandatory reading for all women, especially on imposter syndrome, where this Harvard professor decided to test it out. And, she actually, I don't know if you know about this cartoon back in the 80s, the Smurfs, it's like this blue cartoon character. And she started talking about this. She's making up stuff like this peer-reviewed journal was edited by Gargoyle, which was like the evil Smurf. And these males in the audience are like, bravo, yes, I've read Gargoyle's work. And it was mind-blowing, what she came across in terms of, wow, I shouldn't have imposter syndrome. And it's what Michelle Obama says. Somebody asked her, like, what is it like being in a table full of powerful men? And she's like, you realize pretty fast they're not that smart, but they are so used to their own voice. So here's an example. Like my husband and I were asked to lead a study group for something. And we're literally, I have a theory that you can either marry a gender ally or you can marry the glass ceiling. And thankfully, I'm married to a gender ally, but my best gender ally, by the way. But we were sitting on the sofa and we get this message, can you lead the study? And literally, Satish and I are both like, no, I'm sorry, because we both have our careers and we're busy. Here's a classic example. The guy responded to my husband, no problem, it's all good next time. And he responds to me, why are you such a harsh woman? And so when you look at it linguistically, I used to chair, the American Psychological Association, for languages. And whereas my husband is assertive, I'm aggressive. When I ask for a deadline and I need to, a board member when I was chairing, they were 3 weeks late over a deadline. And they're like, you're crazy, you're hysterical, which has historically been used, is it your period? Is it that time of month to villainize women? But, fortunately at Amnesty, the future is female. The time is now. We just chose our Secretary General, who will lead us for the next 8 years, hopefully, and she's female. And she's amazing. And our chair of the International Board, which I sit on, is female. And she's also very amazing. A lot of times she would just sit there and she was like, Anjhula, please speak. You were saying something, but you were interrupted because it's so common. And we just need to bring that consciousness. Every moment is a teachable moment.
Thank you, Dr. Anjhula. Dr. Ayesha, do you have something to add to stresses at workplace and how they differ across the gender lines?
So, as Dr. Anjhula was talking, I was reflecting, just in terms of my own career trajectory. So I often use this example. When I first went to the US to do my training in psychiatry, one of my mentors, who was a very old guy from Nicaragua, said, Ayesha, you'll have to work 3 times as hard because you're not white, you're an IMG, which means you're an international medical graduate, and you're not even a man, right? So, and you know, at that time, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with this? And I said, hey, don't think much about it. Just work 3 times as hard, because, you know, I was just new. I was like, just do it. And at some point, you know, somebody wanted me to, you know, start working in the area of gender and, you know, as a minority, and, you know, let's work on gender equity in mental health and stuff. And I really, knowing myself, I said, no, I don't want to, because if I get into this, then this will take, you know, everything from me, and I would not be able to focus on my mental health training. But, you know, my glass ceiling came when I moved to Pakistan, and not that I moved to Pakistan, because I moved back to Pakistan in a leadership position. So I, you know, otherwise I did okay. I just kind of kept working 3 times as hard. I came back, and I came back as the chair of a department, and hey, you know, it was like suddenly what just happened, right? I suddenly became a threat. I suddenly became, I'm generally a very soft-spoken, very friendly person. You know, I just kind of go meet with everyone, but all sorts of micro and macro aggressions started happening. And, you know, I kind of got caught in this space where I was like, I can't ignore this. I've got to do something about it. So how does somebody who is a psychiatrist, who's a child adolescent psychiatrist, who's moved to Pakistan to work in the area of mental health, suddenly starts leading a gender equity initiative at AQU Global? Because she faced all of the issues herself, right? And I'm like thinking in my head, if I'm going through all of those, I'm outspoken, I'm out there, I know what's going on, then what about all the other women who may not be able to speak up for some of those things? So all of these things are very real. And as you keep going up, and you know, you go through all sorts of harassment. Again, as I said, micro, macro. I've gone through, you know, workplace harassment. I've gone through sexual harassment. I've got, you know, so name it, and I've had to go through it. And it's not easy. It's very hard, because then I go through each and everything that women write about. That, you know, the first thing that women do is start asking themselves. They're not going to say, okay, that guy was wrong, or this place was wrong, or this, you know, they're doing the wrong thing. They start asking themselves, did I say the wrong thing? Was I too friendly? Did I shake that hand a little bit too long? Was I too wrong? Or, you know, was it not okay for me to go out to that work dinner? You know, did I bring this upon myself? What do I change about myself so this doesn't happen to me again? So it's all internal. Those conversations start happening, and it takes you a long while to be able to get out and say, hey, nothing to do with me. It was this other person who did this, and you've got to accept it, and you've got to now ask for consequences. So it's not an easy path. And I have to say, you know, again, we're talking about mental health, so I don't want to make this just about gender in the sense that only women go through a hard time. I think men do too. The whole area of mental, and in our South Asian region, I think it's, when we look at mental health, it's harder sometimes for men, because they don't have a way to say, I'm feeling anxious. They are not culturally allowed to say, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling low. So they hide it, or they don't deny it, or they don't even accept it, that it's happening to me. Families don't accept it. You know, with women, the anger get internalized. With men, it comes out as anger. Depression and anxiety is expressed as anger. So suddenly they're angry at home, they're angry with their families, they're angry at work as well. They might, you know, in a lot of different ways, and that starts affecting them too. And again, there's no space for them to talk about this in a way. And families also, I think and workplace as well, we just accept it. So I think there are two sides to this thing. We accept the fact that he is aggressive, or families at home will say, you know, he's quirky, or he will get angry, let's not do this, or let's be quiet, or the kids need to go to sleep because, you know, dad's going to get angry, or whatever it might be. He likes his food this way because, you know, he's so stressed out at work. And what happens with that is that if there is a psychiatric illness or a mental illness, it gets pushed back on the burner. It doesn't get addressed, and it keeps getting worse because it's not being addressed. So I think that in both instances, there are lots of you know, workplace reasons as well. And you know, there's a lot of research that very clearly shows that mental illness is the biggest reason for people to take time off from work or call in sick, right? So there's a lot of potential days lost because we're not addressing mental illness. So I think that's a very important piece that I know, again, if I look at it from a very medical perspective as well. So for people who have heart disease, the ones that have a mental illness are going to die 10 years earlier than somebody who has a heart disease and doesn't have a mental illness, right? So there's just significant amount of morbidity that happens, and that brings in a lot of loss economically and financially, and just in terms of productivity as well. That is important to address as in the area of mental health.
Thank you, Dr. Ayesha. Dr. Bushra, do you have anything to add to the discussion?
Yes, Elena, I will be very brief because I can see it's almost the time for our session. So for me, I would really like to add that both men and women are having their own challenges when it comes to the organizational setup. And one among them that I have worked upon is sexual harassment. And it's very interesting to find that both men as well as women are vulnerable to that. However, the problem lies when it comes to victim bashing. The woman, if a woman is being harassed, it's not taken, she's not going to gain any sympathies because people just bash her because she acted in a certain way, because she was dressed into a certain way, or maybe she has shared some kind of information that has actually made her victim to this harassment. So the shift is from the act from the person who is actually being victimized. So for that thing, that the link that is missing is women supporting another woman. So in those gossips and conspiracies that have been that arise afterwards, then what we have found is both men and women are equally. There was not any proportionate differences between bashing of a victim when it comes to a woman witness or a man witness. The thing is that leaking is, of course, there is a divide between men and women. There is harassment, and women are relatively more susceptible to and vulnerable towards harassment. But when it comes to the bashing, the people who bash the victim, there is hardly any difference between a man and a woman. So there then, yes, there is a responsibility of men to be equally supportive towards women, but there is the lacking thing is women supporting another woman. And just to give you an example from my own personal experiences, there are certain traditional roles of a woman which are far more appreciated than those professional. If a woman is being married or having a child, and especially a male child, these things are things which call huge celebrations. But when a woman earns a degree, or maybe gets a career progression, or maybe gets a career promotion, then those things are, relatively less cherished and less celebrated. So these are the things then again, we need to re-evaluate certain standards and certain norms that we have actually made for men and women to be progressive in their careers, and that will take off a little bit of pressure and the burden in the organizations as well. So the need is to actually reevaluate the thinking and the criterion, the performance criterion we set for a man and a woman separately, but on the receiving end, on the judgmental end, then there are men and women equally responsible not to appreciate part of someone else's success, and particularly a woman's success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. Thank you, everybody. I don't know how to express my gratitude for joining me today. Thank you for sharing your insights. We are almost on time. Have a good day. And I hope to stay in touch with all of you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salima.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Lovely meeting everyone.
Same here.